Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anusri Suresh, Research Analyst at the Takshashila Institution, and I have my colleague Vanshika Saraf with me today. Together, we'll be looking at India's recent foreign policy visits and highlights in the neighborhood and beyond. So, little bit of context setting. In the last couple of weeks, again, we had a lot of visits, state visits, and a lot of important visits in the region to discuss various aspects of India's foreign policy. First, we had Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi is undertaking a 3-day visit to India from July 1st to July 3rd, as we are recording this podcast for the 16th India-Japan Annual Summit. And PM Modi undertook a state visit to Seychelles from, I think, June 27 to 29th, attending the Seychelles' 50th independence anniversary as a guest of honor. And they have also signed multiple MOUs and some 1,250 line of credit, all this kind of thing. And we also had some kind of progress happening in the India-US trade deal with US Trade Representative Greer visited New Delhi, I think, in June, leading an official US delegation to advance negotiations on bilateral interim trade deal. And I think the trade deal have now entered the final stage, and they're conducting a comprehensive review of the core BT elements. And also the landmark India-UK Free Trade Agreement has completed all final arrangement, and it's officially scheduled to enter into force from July 15th. And then also we have External Affairs Minister Jaishankar visit to Mongolia and as well as South Korea. And in the region, Bangladesh new Prime Minister Tariq Rahman completed his maiden overseas tour to Malaysia and China, and most importantly, secured some economic and trade commitments in Beijing. So we'll start with the most recent visit, the visit that's happening right now. The Japanese Prime Minister is in India. And so Vanshika is here with me to discuss this in detail. And Vanshika, can you tell us more about how this visit is important, what's on the agenda, and what are some of the outcomes, if there are any?
So everyone knows at this point. The new Prime Minister of Japan, Sanae Takaichi, is visiting India for the first time. And she's one of the first prime ministers to come in with a very strong, overwhelming majority. She won in the election earlier this year. So she's coming with a very strong lower house mandate. No Japanese prime minister in the post-war period has enjoyed such domestic popularity. So I think India should really take note of that. And of course, for us, Japan has always been associated with Shinzo Abe. He was the prime minister for extremely a long time. And him and Modi had a close relationship. And both of them really helped create a lot of frameworks and a very high level of political trust that underpins the modern relationship. So a lot of the infrastructure is already in place. So I think the priority going ahead for both administrations right now is to start, using that foundation to create more deliverables. As you said, on the agenda, there were a lot of things, but I have seen a big evolution in the relationship, because before there was a lot of discussion only on infrastructure and development finance and, your metro and your rail corridor and all of those things. But now we've, evolved. We're talking about economic security, digital cooperations, cooperation on advanced technologies. So I think the relationship in that way has really come a long way. This time there was a joint statement just on artificial intelligence, one on energy resilience. There's also been talk on bioeconomic issues like biogas plants. So I think there is definitely a diversification. If we just look at the trade and investment pillar, right? When Modi visited Japan last year, Ishiba was the prime minister then in August 2025. An announcement was made of a $10 trillion Japanese private investment in India in the next decade. And we've already seen that taking place. So just in the last year, there have been a lot of new Indian subsidiaries of Japanese companies that have opened, like Nippon Yakin, Ferrotech, Mitsubishi, and they all work across like semiconductors, logistics, materials, technology. So we're seeing a lot more Japanese companies and industrial townships also opening in India, which I think is great news. And something that I found very interesting was that last year we discussed state to prefecture partnership. So prefecture is basically how we think of Indian states.
Yeah.
And there were actually Indian chief ministers from Assam, Meghalaya, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Telangana, Chhattisgarh. All these states, the CMs of these states went and visited Japan in the last 1 year to attract FDI, to attract investment in their own states. So I think this says a lot. I'm not sure if chief ministers from, that many chief ministers have gone to another country and, asked for greater investment. But I think this is a great showing that state to state sort of diplomacy has seen a lot of progress.
So, Vanshika, what's your reading of the relationship, though?
So yeah, I think like I was saying, I was very optimistic all this while when I was speaking, but there are also parts that I think are still underwhelming, right? Or are still underperforming. So in 2015 was when we first signed the Defense Equipment and Technology Transfer Agreement, which was big, right? Because the idea was to catalyze joint defense production. But if you see this time, they've only signed an agreement on the co-development of this naval antenna called Unicorn. But I have been following this, and this discussion on this naval antenna has been going on for 2 years now. And now finally it's inked. 2 years before the MOU was, signed, but now it's a full done deal. So I think in that sense, the pace of deliverables, I would say, is slow. It's not that high. I mean, by now we should have signed a lot more sort of co-development programs. That's one. Second, in 2016, actually, India and Japan signed a civil nuclear agreement, which was groundbreaking at that time because the Japanese parliament had to, approve it. And also, it meant that India is finally seen as a responsible nuclear actor by Japan, which always had a tough relationship, with India because of the Pokhran tests and, Japan's own sort of nuclear policy. But so this agreement obviously was extremely ambitious. It allowed for Japanese nuclear material, equipment, technology to be used in India's civilian nuclear program. But actually, if we see, there has been no commercial exchange. The use of this agreement has been extremely modest. So I think that is another area where, we can catalyze. So like I said, the conditions, the environment for more implementation is extremely favorable, much more than they were, say, a decade ago, right? Japan also, if you see, has relaxed restrictions on its defense exports. So we're one of the partner countries that Japan can now sell lethal arms equipment to. Japan has expanded its defense budget, and it's also elevated economic security to a national priority. Similarly, we see in India also, right? Defense indigenization, semiconductor manufacturing, all of these have become very core priorities for our own government. So I would say in terms of policy priorities, both are quite aligned. And even apart from that, I think the biggest alignment comes ideologically. So both India and Japan, I think, share a similar worldview of their neighbor, which is China, and the far neighbor, which is the US. And this summit is unfolding against a time when China-Japan relations are at their worst since normalization. China has increased its coercive actions vis-a-vis Japan, both militarily and economically. And India already, as we know, has borne the brunt of a lot of, these sort of Chinese aggressive tactics. So it is only natural that both of these countries have a sort of similar vision on what a stable and free Indo-Pacific, region looks like. Of course, the US now thinks that Indo-Pacific doesn't exist, but, for Japan and India, it still does. So US can come and say what they want to. Again, the US, I think, both felt a little maltreated by US, especially when it inflicted very high tariffs on both Japan and India, especially Japan, given, it's a US treaty ally. But I think overall, there is a very similar assessment of the current geopolitical order, even because of the West Asian war that India and Japan sort of share. So I think I'm mostly optimistic on the relationship.
Awesome. So, going to the next country of interest right now. So, PM Modi was in Seychelles a few days ago. So, again, can you give us a overview of like what happened there and give us some more context of the relationship, because I don't think it's covered much in the news medias and everything. Maybe some history as well to understand the relationship in detail.
Yeah. So that's interesting, right? So Seychelles, just to give some context to our listeners, is in East Africa. It's the smallest African nation, but it has the highest nominal per capita GDP and the highest HDI ranking of any African country. And there is some interesting history, of the region as well. So Seychelles is, very strategically located. If we see its location, it's right between sort of Madagascar and the Persian Gulf, and it got independent during the Cold War. So 1976 was when Seychelles became independent from the same colonizer, Britain. But basically, why I'm bringing this up is because Seychelles as an island became attractive to both US and Soviet Union, right? US already had some tracking stations there, but because Diego Garcia was also so, in limelight, US was planning to open another base in Seychelles. And Soviet Union, on the other hand, also wanted to secure its own access. Now, during this time, this president he launched a coup, he became the president of Seychelles, was sort of socialist. He had socialist leanings. He had some sort of non-aligned mindset, just like Nehru did. But at the same time, he was also a little authoritarian because, he wanted to consolidate power. So at this time, there were a lot of people who were trying to overthrow him. And at this time, we see the Seychelles president actually coming to India for help when it realized that, it might be overthrown. So there's a story in 1986 when an Indian frigate went to Seychelles, and it reported an engineering problem, which was just a farce. There was no problem actually. And it stayed at the dock for about 15 days. And the ship's extended stay was to warn whoever was going to attempt the coup that, look, New Delhi might intervene. Ultimately, there were no shots fired. There was no sort of Indian occupation. It was very peaceful. But this operation was actually called Flowers Are Blooming, which is why the title of this podcast is also called Flowers Are Blooming. So yeah, this was actually an early example of India's role as a security provider in the Indian Ocean. We always think of India's role in Mauritius and Sri Lanka, which were a lot more violent interventions. But this was sort of a much more quiet sort of support that we gave to a neighbor. And all we needed was like one of our big naval ships in ocean, right? So I think we need to think and explore these historical instances more of our role in the neighborhood. But coming quickly to this visit, so Modi visited as a guest of honor, and it's also marks 50 years of diplomatic relations. Interestingly, the President Hermione, I think it might be pronounced, he conferred this new award called the Guardian of the Blue Horizon on the Prime Minister. He's the first recipient of this distinction. And basically, he cited his work on climate action, on blue economy, on ocean resource management, and in general, sort of advocating the interests of the small island developing states or SIDS. And you mentioned also there was a $175 million economic package. So I'll just break it down. So actually, this was announced in February when the Seychelles president first came to India. So this actually consists of a $125 million rupee denominated line of credit. And there is a component of a $50 million grant. And basically, all of this will fund infrastructure in social housing, e-mobility, health, vocational training, alongside our, maritime and defense security support. So there were several MOUs signed. There were a lot of handovers. So we handed over a fast patrol vessel, 10 utility vehicles, some Radel-class boats, also upgraded some aircrafts. And Indian naval vessel INS Tarkash and INS Ikshak, they participated in the Independence Day celebrations. And this sort of continues the tradition of Indian military participation in the National Day ceremonies of Seychelles. So I think overall it was a very successful visit. And I think more importantly, it also reflected India's own Indian Ocean policy, right? Because we're trying to rely less on some controversial strategic facility in another country, but sort of build our influence through network of locally owned assets, through public goods, and through institutional partnerships.
So definitely flowers are blooming then. So I think in the last conversation we had on the Indian radius and India's foreign policy visits, like 2 weeks ago, we saw that Myanmar's president and Nepal's foreign minister first visited India first, and then they visited China later. But last week, Bangladesh made a different decision. So it chose to first go to Malaysia and then China. So India's not on the cards for now, right? So can you explain what's happening here? Why did Bangladesh choose this path and what that signals about India's neighborhood?
Yeah, so I think it's been, I think, almost 2 weeks now since the new Bangladesh Prime Minister Tariq Rahman, he made his first international trip to Malaysia and then China. He did not come to India at all, which says a lot about the state of our relationship, right? And it's not great. We know the reasons as well. But I was thinking of the other side, right? What if he did choose to come to India? Then he would have got a lot of domestic backlash, because that meant he would restore the same India centric foreign policy which was associated with Sheikh Hasina, right? The entire turmoil in Bangladesh politics happened because of this. And I think if he went to China first, then clearly it would be interpreted as, being closer to pivoting towards Beijing. So I think Dhaka played very smart and went to Malaysia. And I think Malaysia is an important partner for Bangladesh. Before this trip, I did not realize, but Bangladesh has a big labor market that it provides for Malaysia. So when Rahman went, he asked Kuala Lumpur to reopen its labor market to Bangladeshi workers, which recently was shut, and sort of regularize undocumented migrants. So Malaysia had actually restricted the recruitment after there were a lot of concerns about exploitation, about debt bondage, about workers arriving without, the promised employment. So because of this, it chose to go to Indonesia, talk about employment, investment, regional sort of economic integration, rather than choose some sort of major power rivalry. And on the other hand, then we saw him going to China. So with China, of course, he had different demands: greater access to Bangladeshi exports, faster implementation of projects. And China also indicated support for cooperation on Tista River, on the economic corridor. Defense was discussed, but there was no sort of great agreement that was, concluded. So I think there are a lot of, when it comes to the India-Bangladesh relationship, obviously points of friction, right? The biggest is that we continue to host former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, while Bangladesh wants her to face legal proceedings and return to the country. So this will obviously, create sort of the perception that New Delhi still remains invested in the previous political order, and that needs to change. So I think India does realize that just because we invited Bangladesh and they did not accept doesn't mean that we should see this as some sort of strategic betrayal. I think India should continue to invite the Bangladesh leader, doesn't matter what happens, and not, take away too much from its first two visits.
Yeah.
Annie, you mentioned the US, trade representative Greer coming to Delhi a few days ago for another round of negotiations. I am honestly tired by seeing every other week there is some US trade representative coming to Delhi. Can you tell us what the current state of the US India trade deal is?
Yeah. So again, there's a lot of conversation going on about India-US trade deal. So everyone knows that we had a breakthrough in terms of getting an interim trade framework signed in February this year. And now the two nations are actively finalizing a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. So I think although there was a little bit of chaos and uncertainty in the middle of a lot of tariff issues and everything, when US introduced 50% tariff and then we had the framework signed and all those kind of thing. However, now the diplomatic momentum is again kind of restarted following, I think, Marco Rubio's visit in New Delhi in May itself. And then Prime Minister Modi and Trump had a face-to-face meeting during the G7 summit in June this year as well. So as of now, the status is US is applying an 18% reciprocal tariff rate on certain originating Indian goods as of now, while granting broad tariff reductions elsewhere as well. In return, India is systematically cutting duties on various US industrial goods and key agricultural products like, tree nuts, fresh fruits, and soybean oil and all those kind of thing. So this builds on the broader US-India bilateral trade agreement framework, and under which India has also committed purchasing around $500 billion worth of American goods over the next 5 years. And that's also a commitment was kind of reinforced during Mark Rubio's visit as well. And then we have also seen in the last couple of months, after the interim framework was announced, the US Supreme Court's ruling on the use of the IEEPA. which has reduced the Trump administration's ability to kind of instantly impose massive tariff hikes as well. However, nevertheless, the idea is that the threat has not completely disappeared, right? The threat of tariffs, threat of the uncertainty that comes with the sudden tariffs and everything. So even if you look at it, there was some recent US pressure on the automotive sector as well. And there's also always a possibility of like new trade measures via some legal basis or some random announcements and all this kind of thing that we can continue to expect under the Trump administration for sure. Hence, a bilateral trade agreement, while there is a chances of now a random tariff hike might not be possible, that might be less. However, a BTA adds value in terms of giving slightly better comparative advantage than a country with no trade agreement with the US right now. So it kind of gives at least some guarantee over nothing. So that's the thing. And one part to highlight here is that if you look at the trade volume and how that has been shifting since Trump came into a picture. So India-US bilateral trade crossed around $140 billion as of now in the 2025-2026 financial year, while Indian exports grew by just 0.9%. And it's down sharply from the 11.6% growth that we had in the previous year. So imports jumped by 17.2%. So the trade deficit that India used to have or enjoy with the US is kind of narrowing down. And the overall composition of the trade itself is changing actively, right? And the other aspect that you have to consider, since we don't know how the final text is going to look like of India-US bilateral trade agreement. While India is finalizing this pact and everything, the European Union recently crossed the finish line in that sense. So the landmark EU-US tariff agreement, it was originally kind of struck between the political leaders in July itself, July 2025, July last year. And it officially entered into force this year from July 1st onwards. And if you look at it, the clear logic behind the US-EU FTA as well is to kind of secure the trade framework and avoid a scenario where, deemed even more costly for the European exporters if they don't have an FTA. So in that sense, I think that's the same logic that India also has to apply when you're dealing with the US. At the end, you might be still not at a better position of the usual idea of what a trade deal or a free trade agreement means, but still you might be comparatively at a better position than not having a deal in that sense.
Right. Talking about another FTA, which I think is moving faster, is the India-UK FTA, right? And I think our India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal was also in the United Kingdom last week. So can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah. So again, like you said, India's Commerce Minister was in the UK, I think in June last week, to meet his UK counterpart and basically to review the preparedness of both countries for the implementation of free trade agreement that we have with the UK, and also the companion agreement that comes with the Double Contribution Convention from July 15 onwards. It's expected to be implemented. So the sweet part of the deal is that India secured immediate duty-free market access across 99% of its tariff line. So that means for textiles and apparels, the tariffs were slashed up to 12%. And with 87% of India's pharma exports gaining immediate duty-free access, and the Social Security contribution, the Double Contribution Convention agreement basically offers immediate financial relief by exempting temporary Indian IT and engineering SMEs from paying any dual Social Security contributions up to a short-term period. And in return, India kind of will liberalize 90% of the tariff line as well, including we cut down on the tariffs for the high-end British cars by from 110% to 30% in year one and all this. However, the bitter part of the deal is that there's a recent rollout of the UK's steel trade measure, basically to cut its global imports of steel. And I think that will have a lot of negative impact on India's steel export. We briefly discussed it during our last podcast as well. So despite the FTA in picture and going back on what was agreed under the FTA, due to this recent regulatory measures in steel, the negotiated benefit of the free trade agreement will be diluted. So basically under this new framework that UK introduced, UK is kind of cutting down the global tariff-free import caps by 51%, and they're kind of doubling the over quota penalty. Like if any country exports more than the quota given to them, then the penalty for that is like 50% tariff. So earlier it was 25%, now it's like gone up to 50%. So through this, the UK has effectively built a tariff wall around its borders on steel, right? So if you look at it, India doesn't have a lot of market share in UK steel. It's just 6%. And in the last 11th hour discussions that Piyush Goyal and his counterparts had in UK and everything about this, they said that 85% of India's baseline trade in steel will not be affected. Only the remaining 15% across like some 188 tariff lines will be affected as per this framework as of now, which is a good thing. 85% of India's baseline trade is unaffected under this framework. That's a good news that we can celebrate. However, it becomes a challenge when you read it alongside the EU's simultaneous cap on steel from July 1st onwards, which limits the total global imports to some 18.3 million tons. So under this new EU regulation, the out-of-quota customs duty, again, which currently stands at 25%, has been increased to 50% as well. So again, so a lot of India's exports to the EU also will be affected. And usually FTA kind of provides a safe haven for this, that has to be rerouted to UK. So that also won't happen. While this does not take away the other benefits of the FTA, and India definitely stands comparatively better than the other countries who does not have an FTA with UK, but there's some kind of negative impact. I think that's the same logic as we discussed for the US-EU trade deal or in India-US trade deal. If that happens, there are some negative impacts still as we are functioning in this new world order. But again, you take the lesser evil in that sense.
Right. Yeah. And UK politics has also been in a turmoil, right? The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, announced his intention to resign. He does remain Prime Minister until the party selects sort of his successor. And I think there will be formal parliamentary nominations starting sometime next week.
Yeah.
And Andy Burnham is currently sort of very popular and is seen as a front runner. But yeah, whoever becomes the next Prime Minister will be Britain's 7th Prime Minister in 10 years.
Yeah.
Hopefully this does not, and it is unlikely to derail the India-UK FTA. But there is a risk that, politically there are a lot of distractions and maybe implementation might be slower. We don't know.
Yeah.
But next week we have a very interesting diplomatic calendar. PM Modi will be visiting Indonesia, New Zealand for the first time, and then Australia. So we will be back again next week to discuss this and more.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.